Welcome to the Venezuelanalysis podcast. I'm your host, José Luis Granados Ceja. The Venezuelanalysis podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground English language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. You'll hear news and independent analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftist and grassroots forces. Happy to be here with Ricardo Vaz, editor at Venezuelanalysis. Ricardo, frequent guest here on the program. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. I'm always excited when you invite me back. So yeah, looking forward to catching up on all the latest developments here. It's never a dull moment in Venezuela, which is, I mean, it has its downsides, but it's also, I mean, if you're a reporter, then you're never out of
It
work.
keeps us busy. I was just going to say that. You make it sound like
Yeah.
I'm the one who decides everything. I'm just the host, everybody. He's like, oh, thanks for having me back. For those of you who don't know, Venezuelanalysis, we operate in a collective way, in a horizontal way. We make decisions together. It's not really an imposition or anything of the sort. But of course, we are always happy to have Ricardo. And speaking of the organization, I have to mention that we are in the midst of our fundraising campaign. And we decided to keep it simple this year and just talk about independent journalism. That's what we do to bring you news and analysis about Venezuela on the ground, raising the voices of the Bolivarian grassroots, but of course also maintaining that independent position. And that's made possible thanks to the support of our readers, our viewers, and our listeners who appreciate the work that we do here at Venezuelanalysis. And so we are in the midst of our yearly fundraiser. This is how we keep the operation going. It's your donations, it's your support that allows us to stay independent and not have to go and ask for support elsewhere that could possibly infringe on our editorial line, right? We would never accept a situation like that. That's why it's so important to support. If you believe in anti-imperialist media, if you believe in a grassroots perspective, if you understand that this niche that we try to fill is important, please go to our website, venezuelanalysis.com. You'll get the pop-up, or go and hit the big red donate button. Support independent journalism. We have lots of different ways to do that. You can do a Patreon for those of you who are fans of the podcast, and you actually get our episodes a little bit early. But you can also do donations via Venmo, via Zelle. You can write to us about figuring other ways of getting in touch with us. So in order to make a donation, of course, we also have this easy donor box here. So help us get this thermometer up. Otherwise, Ricardo's going to have a hard time this week, feeling bad because we're only at $395 of 15,000. So our goal this year is $15,000. That helps support the work of myself, of Ricardo, of Andreina, of Cira, who've also been on this program, but also Fanny, who runs our social media. She's a member of the team as well. Ricardo, I wanted to give you an opportunity. Do you have anything you want to say to our folks here before we move on to the nitty-gritty of the show to talk about this donation, why it's important?
Yeah, you pretty much said it all. It's what ensures that our editorial line stays independent. And we run a modest operation. I mean, let's not fool anyone about it. And we apologize in advance because people are going to be seeing the pop-up and it can be annoying, but at the same time realize that we are entirely reliant on these reader donations. And so we have to do this once a year. It's not our forte, but it comes with the territory. And we're not, as Jose Luis was saying, we're not about to surrender the independence of our editorial line. And so we encourage everyone to donate. Especially, monthly subscriptions are really the most important because it allows us to plan and expand more in the long term. And if you support us via Patreon, then you will get early access to the podcasts, which are the most regular multimedia content that we produce, but also, videos that we produce on certain occasions will also arrive to you earlier than usual. So yeah, hit that donate button or look out for your email inbox. We will be in touch in the coming weeks and asking for support to keep our work going and expanding.
It really is indispensable. So we really do appreciate everybody who's able to support us. And we're going to move on to this week's news. And I figured we would start here. I wanted to read this article out. Venezuela denounces offensive Bolívar Act and U.S. recognition of Edmundo González as president-elect. Caracas criticized Washington for repeating the failed strategy of backing in opposition figures' presidential claims. The Venezuelan government has strongly condemned the Bolívar Act, a new bipartisan legislation approved by the U.S. House of Representatives aimed at tightening economic sanctions against the country. But the part I wanted to talk about, I think this is not anything new. We know that it seems in this lame duck period, they want to set everything on fire that they possibly can. It's really quite extraordinary. not to get into issues that are not really relevant to Venezuela, but in a sense that they are. We do know that Biden approved the use of long-range missiles for Ukraine against Russia. We see a cracking down on the Venezuelan government and its ability, and new sanctions. We're going to get into that as well. This Bolivar Act. But I think the part that is most worrisome, and I think the part that's probably the most interesting to our viewers, is this bit about recognizing Edmundo González as the president-elect. So, just to recap everybody on the situation. As we know, there were elections on July 28th, Chavez's birthday, that saw Maduro be awarded the victory by Venezuelan institutions, who signaled that he had secured another 6-year term, which is actually set to begin in January. And as usual, as has happened in nearly every single election where they didn't win, the opposition cried fraud, saying that no, these results don't actually prove anything. We have different results. We are not going to contest via the formal channels. We're just going to make a lot of noise, as we always do. And then, of course, as we know, Edmundo González goes into exile. Maria Corina Machado, no one knows where she is. We had some reports we talked about on the last episode that she has fled the country as well. But it's a routine that we've seen before. Opposition cries fraud. Opposition runs and demands things of U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism kind of, equivocates for a little bit, and now we know that they have decided to go for what is essentially the Guaidó 2.0 strategy. And we were worried about this. We use this language. Is this really the way they're going to go? Are they going to pretend that somebody who wasn't elected is the president of the country, as they did with Juan Guaidó, which as we know, unleashed a series of terrible circumstances for the Venezuelan people, the stealing of assets. We're going to talk about that on the program later as well. But obviously the effort to diplomatically isolate, to try to harm the Venezuelan government. We'll see how far they're willing to go. Will they transfer assets as they did before? Will they steal resources to fund this charade? We don't know. But here we are, once again, before a circumstance where U.S. imperialism, where the White House has decided to recognize a figure that has not been recognized by Venezuela's institutions, Venezuela's sovereign institutions, as the president-elect. And this is really worrisome. Finally on this, and I'll hand it over to you here, Ricardo, we saw some discussion about this possibility, but it looks like it was at the G20 in Brazil where the U.S. finally started to send its message that Blinken on the sideline was telling everybody, actually moving forward, we are going to say that Edmundo González, the standing candidate for Maria Corina Machado, the far-right opposition leader of Venezuela, as the president-elect. And I wanted to know, Ricardo, what do you make of this? What do we have to say when it comes to this strategy? What does it tell us about Biden? And will this have implications for the Trump administration, which is also set to take office in January?
I think the first thing to consider is that there are many actors here, many interests, and this is a complex situation. So when we did an episode a while ago, when González had just left the country, we actually were pretty confident that Guaidó 2.0 was not going to come to effect. We didn't know that Trump it was before the US election, and we predicted, even in the case of a Trump victory, that they would not go down the same route. And it's still possible, although, you know, the signs are pointing in the other direction. You know, on one hand, the appointment of a very hawkish figure like Marco Rubio to lead the State Department. And now this one falls into what you were saying, as the Biden administration setting everything on fire and, in a way, trying to corner the Trump administration, you know, trying to limit its room for maneuver so that later they can say, oh, look, you know, Trump is soft on dictators, you know, quote unquote dictators. You know, with this, the Democrats being much more, acting much closer to the official discourse of the US as some kind of global policeman for freedom and democracy, and Trump not really caring so much about appearances. With that being said, I still think, I mean, recognizing a president-elect is kind of the final step before, you know, recognizing an actual government. So that will be an early test for Trump, because he takes office after Maduro, so he doesn't have a decision to make before then, to see if he goes down the same route of recognizing a parallel government with many differences. You know, first and foremost, the fact that González is abroad. He says he's going to return to the country, and he said suddenly he found his courage, like the lion in The Wizard of Oz. He found his courage somehow, and now claims he's ready to be arrested and come back to the country. I mean, he could have just stayed here. He wouldn't have been arrested. He was in a diplomatic confines. So, but anyway, it's kind of the Venezuelan opposition trying to amp up the noise and look more active because they haven't done anything for a couple of months at least. I mean, they tried, we talked about this, they tried street mobilizations and couldn't even get their own people out in their own strongholds. The last public rally was so poor that even Maria Corina Machado did not appear to speak to the crowd. So they need to at least show some strength if they want the US to actually, carry this flag again and do their bidding and pressure and get some kind of regime change, a serious regime change operation in motion. With that being said, I still think it's, for one, Trump is a bit unpredictable in some cases, and he has this reality TV background, so he might not really be inclined to follow a plan that failed last time around. Also, it depends on who's running policy. Of course, Rubio is a hawk and a hardliner, but there are other figures in the administration who might favor, what's the word that the media is always using, a transactional approach, and not really go through this recognizing a parallel structure altogether, because it also limits control. It forces them to actually work with these people, forces them to transfer resources, whereas they could retain more control and actually have more leverage over the Venezuelan opposition by not doing so. So that's the kind of decision that they have to make.
Now, you mentioned Marco Rubio, so I think it's important for us to talk about that a little bit here. As we know, we saw this message from Maduro. He congratulated Trump on his win. He said that we needed renewed respect relations here. I'll read this quick quote here. "This is a new beginning for us to aim for a win-win situation that benefits both the United States and Venezuela," said President Nicolás Maduro. So this was in the days following Trump's election victory in the United States. And, I think it's obvious. Some people say, look, what business does Maduro have trying to cozy up to a far-right actor like Trump? We have to remember, there's been a lot of information that came out after Trump left office. There are a lot of memoirs written, a lot of reports written. And one of the things that was kind of very clear in any of those was that Trump actually had a begrudging respect for Maduro. A sense like, oh, he's a tough guy, and had very little respect for Guaidó. He saw him as weak. I think he called him a Venezuelan Obama or something like that, which is not.
Oh, the Beto O'Rourke.
Oh, the Beto O'Rourke of Venezuela. Yeah, there you go. And I know in a lot of these reports, we also saw that the White House is really frustrated with the Venezuelan opposition. So, viewers of this program will know the Venezuelan opposition is famous for two things: being disunited, coming together only really with a lot of difficulty, and also being pretty politically inept. They overpromise and underdeliver, and they consistently did this in all of their negotiations directly with Washington when they were engaged in the maximum pressure strategy, trying to effect regime change in Venezuela. For example, the military uprising they attempted to pull off, right? They promised, high-ranking members of the military are going to turn, and you're going to see so many troops are going to join in. Of course, that didn't materialize. And I think the sense inside of the White House was that these people are not able to deliver what they're saying, and we should stop trusting them. And there was definitely a sense where, well, we engaged in the maximum pressure strategy, the sanctions are in place, but this kind of let's trust the opposition to follow through on their commitments is not a viable strategy. One of the major forces behind that was John Bolton, and he was eventually ousted from the White House. And so I think this idea that there is no way to negotiate with Trump is a confused one, an incorrect one. Because I do think that an effort to try to get close to him would be a smart move for the Venezuelan government. And I know there's been other articles since Trump's election, this last one, that suggest that there are some people close to him. We have to understand Trump, in his heart, is a capitalist. He's interested in the interests of capital. I don't mean that in the ideological sense, in that his friends are owners of capital. Some of them are close to oil interests. Some of them are Texans who want to see a more normal relationship. They want to be able to import Venezuelan crude and refine it here and sell it or sell it elsewhere. There is an interest there. And as we know, the licenses haven't exactly eliminated the participation of U.S. capital entirely in Venezuela. But the Rubio thing, that is worrisome for me. Marco Rubio being in charge of U.S. foreign policy, knowing what his positions on Cuba, on Venezuela, on Nicaragua, even on some of the, lighter shade of red countries, Lula, Mexico, right, has been a hard line. And before I share my analysis, I wanted to hear from you, Ricardo, about specifically Marco Rubio. So we know Trump, maybe he can be worked with. Can you really work with Rubio? But will Venezuela even be in his crosshair?
Yeah, I think the first question is how big a priority is Venezuela for the new administration? Because I mean, when we think about Trump, he doesn't necessarily need a victory. He only needs something that he can sell as a victory. And keep in mind that one of the main things he used in his campaign was this constant scarecrow of the migrants, and particularly demonizing Venezuelan migrants. And so, if he wants to, I mean, he's not going to do this mass deportation for, practical reasons, if anything else. But if he wants to do some kind of PR stunt around deportation, he will have to work with the Maduro government. I mean, there's no way around it. There's nobody else here that can, with the legal authority and the capacity to receive deported migrants. And so it may very well be the case that it falls under this, to use the same word, transactional approach where, the White House agrees with the Venezuelan government to send some thousands of migrants in return for some very limited licenses of, joining the two interests when we talked about the Texas ones, having some temporary licenses that will allow certain companies to purchase Venezuelan crude. So it's definitely going to be a struggle between hardliners, like Rubio, and the more pragmatic capitalists like the Texas oil lobbyists to see where the Venezuela policy goes. But I think one sign, or one thing that we could read as a sign, is the Bolivar Act, the previous report that you were showing, because the Bolivar Act, besides the offensive use of Bolivar, these people finally found a way to turn an acronym into Bolivar. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't forbid anything that's not already forbidden. And if something is exempt from sanctions, it doesn't forbid that either. So it is a way to look tough and, perhaps in the long term, move the kind of executive imposition of sanctions towards a more legislative approach. But it doesn't really change the reality on the ground. So it's really more symbolic. It's a way to look tough. So it might very well be the case that the Trump administration looks for some kind of approach where it says, we are imposing super harsh sanctions and we are even forcing them to take back migrants, but essentially keeps things as they are and tries to take advantage of sanctions to secure very favorable deals for these oil interests in the US. Like we saw with Chevron. Chevron is currently operating in the country, is responsible for maybe 25% of the Venezuelan oil output. Not just Chevron, let's say the joint ventures in which Chevron is involved, but Chevron is getting a much larger slice of the pie than it should, according to its stakes in the respective projects, precisely because sanctions limited the Venezuelan government's ability, and so Chevron takes on more responsibilities than it should.
The only thing I would add to that would be that I think the attention of this administration in the US, the incoming Trump administration, is definitely going to be on China above all. That's their global rival. That is a threat to their hegemony. Venezuela isn't. Mexico isn't. Brazil isn't. And I think their focus is going to be on trying to ensure US hegemony, that it is the more powerful state in the country, in the face of a threat of a very powerful, rising, organized, and economically better positioned country like China, and which has better relationships with the rest of the world. So I think most of what we'll see, when it comes to Latin America, from Marco Rubio, from the Trump administration, is going to be organized around that notion. There isn't going to be explicit, targeting of progressives or leftist governments in the region. It's definitely going to be sort of a consequence of the much broader strategy, which is one that is focused on China. Now, in your response here, you talked a little bit about the economic situation in Venezuela, and I thought we would shift gears here and talk about this piece here. Maybe you can lay it out for us, Ricardo. Venezuela's central bank issues IOU bonds as businesses eye privatizations. The Maduro government has looked to tackle a devaluation of the national currency that has endangered recent low inflation. And so we know that there is a lot of work behind the scenes that is maybe less visible by Venezuela's institutions to create certain macroeconomic stability. We know that there's been many concessions made to the interests of private capital in the midst of the war that is being waged on Venezuela. Later on in the program, we're going to talk about an event that I went to here in Mexico, where we spent a lot of time, discussing what is the economic panorama for Venezuela. But I wanted you to talk about this because, as you said in your previous response, right, all of these changes, the Bolivar Act, this recognition of Edmundo González, it essentially doesn't really change anything on the ground. But there are some worrisome signs if you look at these economic indicators. So can you break that down for us, Ricardo?
Indeed. So starting from where you left it off, there are some worrisome signs in the Venezuelan economy. It's worth mentioning that, we might not talk about sanctions for a while when there's nothing new, but that just means that the overall architecture is still firmly in place, and that means a very limited room for maneuver for the Venezuelan government, being blocked out of financial markets, not accessing credit, forced to sell oil via discount. And so in recent years, we had this terrible hyperinflation, and the government went towards a kind of liberal orthodox approach to try and tame it, and it successfully did so. Inflation in at least a couple of months, the last month that there were public numbers available, is now at the lowest level since early 2013. So it certainly worked in terms of stabilizing the economy. The downside is that the government was forced to make some concessions to the private sector, and in particular, loosen regulation. And one of them was forex controls, foreign exchange controls. The central bank actually deciding who gets access to foreign currency and for what purpose. Instead, it delegated that responsibility to the banks, and but it remains as the main supplier of foreign currency. So there's always this wishful thinking that the Venezuelan bourgeoisie is going to put in its own resources, it's going to bring in the capital that it has stashed abroad. And it has never really materialized to any significant degree because the Venezuelan bourgeoisie knows that, the easy way or the hard way, they're going to access this subsidized oil rent, which is what allowed their accumulation in the first place. So now what we've seen in recent months is a trend where you have this parallel exchange rate going up and up, and the central bank is essentially throwing money at it, thinking that this is a problem of insufficient demand, and that maybe by supplying more foreign currency it's going to bring the problem under control. But it hasn't worked so far, even though it has supplied a lot, hundreds of millions of dollars in recent weeks. It has already surpassed the levels supplied in 2023, and we still have more than a month to go. And the issue at heart is that this is a problem of speculation. This gap between the official exchange rate and the parallel exchange rate allows private businesses, and especially the main economic actors, to increase their profit margins. So it is in their interest to maintain it and eventually force even more concessions from the government in the long run. We mentioned in this piece that these industrial guilds are eyeing privatizations of hundreds of state companies that, because of the economic difficulties and the sanctions, have essentially stopped operating, and now it's an opportunity for this private sector to get them on the cheap. So it is a very difficult balance that the government has to strike in trying to maintain social programs, in trying to maintain bonuses and living standards, while maintaining this climate of economic peace with low inflation and economic growth. It's worth saying that Venezuela is going to have the fourth successive year of GDP growth. It's still a long way to go before reaching the levels prior to this devastating economic crisis. But again, it's very difficult to maintain that balance while you have this private sector that, in a way, contributed to a certain economic peace. But I think I say it in another article. The tiger does not change its stripes. Its interest is still to maximize profits at all circumstances. And in this case, a foreign currency gap between the official and parallel exchange rate offers an opportunity to even maximize their gains.
So sometimes when we talk about economic issues, I feel like we zoom out a little bit too much. So I was wondering if you could zoom back in. What is the economic reality for Venezuelans today? As someone who lives and works in Caracas, right? You're familiar, you have friends. Is there a sense that things are improving and there is a risk of that being lost? Or does it feel like the weight just keeps on getting heavier?
I mean, the word I like to use is precarity. So the situation remains very precarious for the majority of the population. Of course, there's always people who are well off. Overall, I mean, we had maybe a year or 10 months of economic stability in the sense that the foreign exchange rate was stable, and that means that prices are stable. And that really brings a sense of relief, the fact that when people have bolivares, the local currency, when they have them in their bank accounts, they can leave them there. They're not worried about spending them immediately because they're going to be worth 5% or 10% less if they wait a week. So now, I mean, in these past couple of months, there has been this devaluation that I was talking about. It's still nowhere near the climate that we saw 5 or 4 years ago, but there is a sense of worry that starts to arrive, and then of course it becomes a spiral where people get more desperate, and that brings desperation for the actors downstream in the productive chain. So if someone, a main supplier, raises prices, then everybody else will also raise prices. That increases the cost of living. That maybe forces people to go and buy dollars in the black market if they feel that it's going to get devalued. So we're still not in any kind of spiral, and the central bank is desperately trying to bring that under control. It also issued these bonds that we talk about in this report to try and absorb liquidity from the market, and with that try and bring inflation under control. It's still a very monetarist approach, thinking that it's liquidity that's driving up inflation. And I think at some point it will have to resort again to some harder regulatory chops to try and at least scare the private sector a little, and let them know that they cannot get away with everything. But so far it has been trying to navigate this newfound difficulties, especially in the holiday season where people are going to spend more and there's going to be more consumption. Nobody wants instability right now, but I think at some point they will have to revisit this approach that up until now has been more focused on liberalizing and try and find a balance with regulation.
Right. Well, you used this word liberalization. Earlier, you talked about privatization, and I thought we should talk about this, which is it looks like there's an effort to privatize Monómenos. Now, Monómenos is a subsidiary of Pequiven, and it is considered Venezuela's second most important foreign asset. The first one being Citgo. We've talked about Citgo in other episodes, no need to revisit that. But as we know, it's under threat of being chopped up and sold off, although it looks like there's been a pause on that for reasons. But I want to talk about Monómenos, partially because you and I always joke, Ricardo, is that I've become an expert on this company. So I think part of it is because I like the word Monómenos. It comes out nicely. But what we've seen is a push on the side of the Venezuelan government, surprisingly, for its privatization, to sell it off. Now, there's a lot of reasons behind it. One is sanctions, right? Monómenos is kind of operating in a gray area where it was one of the assets that was handed over to the opposition during the maximum pressure campaign that was under their control. It was riddled with scandals and actually suffered greatly under their management. It was returned to Venezuela when Gustavo Petro became president of Colombia, who wanted to pursue relations with Venezuela, positive, diplomatic, economic. They've had all kinds of meetings. We know the story. But Monómenos in particular is really important to the Petro government in Colombia because it's a major supplier of very important inputs for agricultural production. It's an agrochemical company, mostly focused on fertilizers, but other goods as well. And he views Monómenos and its place in the productive chain for the countryside as very critical. It's critical infrastructure. It provides stable, good, reliable supply of inputs that are necessary for the production in the countryside. Now, the problem is, because Monómenos operates in kind of this gray area, there's a potential for it to be sanctioned and no longer to be able to operate and to actually be put in a very precarious, to use that word, situation. So there is an interest on behalf of the Venezuelan government to sell it. But there's also some rumors that part of it is a bit of a diplomatic message to Petro. Knowing that it's important to him, they are putting it on the table because Petro was part of this kind of weird, unofficial, unrecognized, it ended up becoming nothing group of countries, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, who are trying to find a solution to the post-election crisis in Venezuela. And I think that disturbed people in Caracas. You know, the sense of, we backed you up when they were trying to oust you via lawfare. Now you're going to use some of these arguments against us. You're not respecting Venezuelan sovereignty. And so there is some rumor, none of this has been confirmed, that that's part of the motivation. All that to say is that Monómeros, this company, Venezuela's second most important asset, was founded jointly by Colombia and Venezuela, eventually became fully Venezuelan when Chavez bought off the shares, might be privatized. It's on the table. And Gustavo Petro published an open letter saying that, quote, the privatization and sale of Monómeros will lead to higher prices for primary agricultural products in our country. So basically saying, don't sell it. This is too important. So important that we actually saw that the superintendency for corporations intervene and actually step in to prevent it. Now, it's interesting. Colombia is such a capitalist country in the sense that it has really powerful institutions, autonomous bodies like the superintendency that can basically take over a company. It's not the first time. When it was under the mismanagement of the opposition, Monómeros was put under control by this state institution to save it, basically. And we see that once again, the superintendency has intervened to try to stop this from happening again because of the important role it plays in Colombia's countryside and for its agricultural producers. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about this. Do you think there's any truth to this being a diplomatic message? And do you think this privatization is actually going to go through? Will we see the sale of this really critical asset?
I'm skeptical about it being tied to diplomacy. I think this is a much more important asset with long-term implications. But if you wanted to draw a causal line, there's some substance to it because there was this message, and then recently Petro said that he kind of toned down the rhetoric on the Venezuelan election, said, there has to be a solution in the long term, and kind of did a mea culpa saying that, the biggest threat to fair elections are U.S. sanctions. Something to that effect. It was an interview he gave while in Brazil for the G20 meeting. But that being said, I think he has a genuine concern on the role that Monómeros is playing. I think it's a key supplier for products like coffee and palm oil, which are also major Colombian exports. And not just that, the rumor was that another major competitor in the fertilizer market was the rumored buyer. So that would lead to a kind of monopolistic position that would allow them to hike up prices and essentially have ripple consequences for Colombian agriculture and food prices and so on. The Colombian government has also been very proud of having very, very low inflation. So we have openly said, nobody cares what we think, but we have openly said that the best solution is for the Colombian state through some institution to purchase a majority stake of Monómeros, leave Venezuela with a minority stake, which would then mean it is not subject to sanctions. In theory, because sanctions only apply to assets where there's a majority capital owned by a Venezuelan state institution. That would no longer be the case. And with a minority stake, that would have to be negotiated between the parties, it would still allow Venezuela to receive some dividends, even if in a global context of sanctions, there are workarounds. The countries share a border, so it's easier to bring stuff back and forth. So, and the Petro government, according to different reports, is actually looking for that solution or solution of that kind. It's not clear if it's just buying a majority stake or if it's buying the company altogether. It's reported looking for financing options and so on. So maybe the intervention by the superintendents here is to buy time, to allow the Colombian state, the Colombian government to find a solution that will keep Monómeros playing the role that has been played so far. But the clock is ticking. You were mentioning the existing sanctions waiver that expires in July. So essentially, the Venezuelan government, according to these reports at least, wanted to get rid of the problem, just sell the company, have some much needed cash injection in the near term, and that's no longer a problem. Of course, you lose an important asset in the long run. Or is Petro going to be able to find a better solution that could be a better solution for everyone in the long term, by finding a way to keep monomerous operating as it is without being vulnerable to sanctions. And of course, it all depends on what attitude or what approach the Trump administration brings once it comes out. But I think this is another example. Of course, it's very different from what we were talking before, but I think it also showcases how the Venezuelan government operates in very difficult circumstances. The choices it has are often, just a multitude of bad choices. Then think, what's the least bad choice that I can take in this context right now? There's also, there are always treasury shortages. You have to pay Christmas bonuses and so on. So sometimes, the pragmatic short-term approach trumps everything else, even if it would jeopardize a long-term asset like monomerous. So, it goes to show just how sanctions condition everything and condition the long-term planning that the Venezuelan government wanted to be able to do. So, we'll keep an eye on what happens in monomerous. Also, we will go back to Citgo at some point, because it has become so complicated that, even the vultures are fighting amongst themselves to see, what's the most effective way to plunder the company. But unlike monomerous, I think the Citgo case is pretty much lost. It's just a matter of who gets the bounty. Here, I think there's still a way for the solution to benefit the Venezuelan state, the Colombian state, and the agricultural sector at large.
Before we move on to our final topic here, I wanted to jump back because you mentioned sanctions, and very recently we saw a new round of sanctions. Once again, Treasury Department named a bunch of individuals. In fact, one of the individuals is a friend of Venezuelanalysis here, William Castillo. So it shows that they're far-reaching, right? This isn't just Maduro and his cronies, which, to use the language that the Treasury does, or the White House. But this actually has pretty serious consequences. It ends up reaching and impacting people really directly. So before we move on to our final topic, I wanted to get your thoughts here on this latest round of sanctions and just how ever-present it seems like this threat is, right? We're right now supposedly on a more progressive Democratic administration in its final days. Here it is issuing sanctions. We'll see what Trump does, but we know based on, if we go with what he did last time, it's likely going to be a hardening of that position towards Venezuela. So finally, before, like I said, we could talk a bit about this latest round of sanctions. What does it tell us?
Yeah, I think the Treasury note says that the US government has now sanctioned 2,000 officials here in Venezuela. So that's a lot of cronies. It's, at some point, you're going to think that the entire Venezuelan population is just made up of Maduro cronies. Again, I think this has two aspects about it. One of it is symbolic, looking tough and saying, oh, we are sanctioning everyone who is complicit with this, enemy. But it includes the planning minister, the communications minister. It's just, they look at the list. They must have an Excel spreadsheet, and what lines are not read, and those people are sanctioned. I always think that what sanctions do, for people who haven't read the text and don't bother with this boring minutia, is it freezes assets that these sanctioned people might have in the US, and it also imposes visa restrictions, so people cannot travel to Disney World. But I always felt it would be a PR victory for the US to actually say, this minister owns a mansion in Florida, if that were true. Of course, they never do it. And I think that's clearly a sign that they can't really find these embarrassing PR smoking guns. That isn't to say that all these officials, I'm not going to put my hands over the fire for them. But I'm sure they are smart enough to either not have things in their name or to go to jurisdictions where they wouldn't be vulnerable to these sanctions, which can come sooner or later. And some of them might even not be that important or have any assets abroad. Of course, this does have an impact because once someone is sanctioned, they cannot really enter into negotiations or sign contracts. So, for example, if the communications ministry wants to import cameras from, France, then the communications minister cannot sign it because it's under sanctions. So it just adds more hurdles and makes the cost of doing business higher. And so that has this kind of over-compliance effect in the long term in terms of making Venezuela toxic and making it harder for Venezuelan entities to conduct any kind of business abroad. And it also fits into the prior pattern that we were discussing of trying to corner the Trump administration, because it's much easier to put sanctions than to extract them, because then you have to assume the political cost of doing so. So I think that's another thing that the Biden administration is doing, taking advantage of the fact that there was a recent change in the military high command, so they just sanctioned the new leaders and a couple of other people, like I was saying, the planning and communications ministers.
And of course, we actually have an article on the website, a column from our colleague Andreina Chavez, that talks about this bipartisan imperialist consensus that we know exists. And I think this is just yet another sign that it doesn't matter who's in the White House, ultimately the policy is going to be imperialist. So worth paying attention to, but also worth resisting, right? I think we identify as an anti-imperialist media outlet. I identify personally as an anti-imperialist journalist for a reason. I maintain that it is the primary contradiction. National liberation is the path forward. It is what's opening up new possibilities, as obviously we've seen in the case of the Palestinian resistance, which has wildly changed things. And a side note there, quite ironic that the country that is actively now trying to protect somebody with an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, speaking, of course, about the prime minister of the Zionist entity, Benjamin Netanyahu, thinks that it has the moral authority to sanction anybody and everybody in a country that it has deemed an enemies. But like I said, this is also worth resisting. And I wanted to close today's program with a little bit of a conversation around this event that I attended here in Mexico City, put on by the organizations that do solidarity work here in Mexico with Venezuela. So there's an incredible group, Mexicans coordinator with Solidarity with Venezuela. And this event was held actually in a beautiful venue here in Mexico City. It's the cultural space of one of the boroughs here in the capital. Really quite well-attended event. I think the thing that really jumped out at me was the commitment of the people. Full house on Friday night, full house all day Saturday, people actively paying attention, participating, asking questions. I wanted to highlight, for example, we had our friends from the Unión Comunera. We talked a lot about the Unión Comunera on the podcast and elsewhere. Jennifer Lamus from El Marisal, who's actually been interviewed, and is also, you can see the content that we've worked with her on the website, was also one of the speakers there speaking about the experience of building the commune, focused a lot on sort of the institution of it, like how it's made possible, but obviously a lot of really interesting conversations on the sidelines as well, like what is it actually like to live in a commune? People were really genuinely, sincerely interested in that. And actually we talked a lot about some of the topics that we talked about here on this program. We had a friend from Misión Verdad who did a breakdown of the various efforts that the Venezuelan government has engaged in to be able to kind of rise above the political situation, the economic situation above all. I found his presentation quite interesting in the sense that, we talk a lot, we talked about it on this program, about certain accommodations that have been made with private capital. And the truth is that, as much as we understand that capital does have the interest of securing and maximizing profits, they too, in a sense, are impacted by the entire unilateral coercive measures regime. And so his presentation largely focused on the negotiating that the Venezuelan government has done with this segment of the bourgeoisie, which isn't allied with the far right, which isn't interested in perpetuating regime change, which isn't supportive of the sanctions regime, and the way that they've tried to negotiate in the midst of this context of a economic war that is being waged against Venezuela. And I thought we'd go through some of the pictures here. That's actually the mayor of the borough. So we've seen also, this effort by organizations here in Mexico to build direct political connections with political leaders in Mexico, with those in Venezuela. Actually, there are many of the comrades who participated here actually are in Venezuela right now to participate in an anti-fascist event that is happening there. In the background is Hector Diaz Polanco, He is now actually one of the key leaders of Morena, the left-wing party in Mexico City now. So you can see that these kinds of efforts. The reason I wanted to highlight one is because I rarely get to talk about on-the-ground stuff that I do for Venezuela because I'm not based in Venezuela. Obviously, my colleagues are. But also because this work is really valuable, right? Like this is what if I'm going to deliver a political message to the people who are watching us right now, this is the kind of work we have to do. We have to really strengthen those relationships, people to people, right? Like people like Jessica from El Maizal, but also between political representatives, right? I know that there are lots of viewers in the United States who are close to DSA. How can we get the DSA to also pay more attention to Venezuela? I know that there are many people who are doing it. Don't want to suggest that they're not, but I wanted to highlight this work because this is important. This is the kind of work that needs to be done. There's a picture of Jessica and some of the attendees. There was a cultural element. We had some music. Obviously, no podía faltar la canción de Ali Primera, right? Ali Primera had to be sung there as well. So I wanted to share these photos with you and provide my feedback there. That's my comrade there, Irma Sofia. She plays an incredible role leading the work of these organizations to build solidarity and build these links. We also saw lots of people from all parts of Mexico coming this. Mentioned here, actually, this is part of a seminar that they do every year to discuss the situation in Venezuela, to build these links between people and organizations. They do it in collaboration with the embassy here, with the ambassador Francisco Arias Cárdenas. And so it was a really enriching experience for me to be able to participate in that. And I wanted to share that with everybody here on the program as a moment to reflect on the importance of international solidarity. You know, it's work that I did when I lived in Toronto. It's work that I do here in Mexico now that I live and work here in Mexico City. And people might say, well, what business do journalists have taking these explicit political positions? Well, because I think that's what journalism demands of us, right? We are not the New York Times, the Washington Post. We're not here to pretend that we're unbiased. Yes, I'm biased. I'm biased in favor of the working class. I'm biased in favor of revolution. And so I think it's important, of course, to be able to put ourselves in a position where we're actually able to carry that out, to actually do the work of participating in solidarity building. And for those of you who can't, there's Venezuelanalysis. And so I wanted to finally close with another pitch. This is our yearly fundraising period. I want to ask people who are able to support, to donate, whatever you can. Above all, if you're able, be a sustainer. And Ricardo, there's a special gift for people who give a certain amount. So maybe you can fill them in and let them know how they can get one of those beautiful t-shirts you're wearing right now.
Yeah, I'll just try and show the design. I'm not sure how successfully, but yes, we had a great friend, someone who collaborates with us along the way very frequently. Kayla Bello is a wonderful Venezuelan artist, and he designed this image with a very apt slogan, which is "Strike Back Against the Empire." It's inspired in Star Wars for all our nostalgic fans out there. We know there are plenty. I mean, even within Venezuelanalysis, I'm not going to name names, but I just wanted to highlight one point that you made about us as journalists taking political positions. I mean, independence and impartiality are not the same thing, and we have always been very clear about it. I mean, and of course, it's a liberal illusion to believe that you can be a distant, impartial observer when you are doing journalism. So we don't hide it. I mean, we are in favor of the Venezuelan poor and working class majority in this revolutionary process that actually has consequences way beyond the Venezuelan borders. So there's no contradiction there. But we are an independent outlet in the sense that we do not take resources from any corporate or political backer, and so we are the ones who define the editorial line. And as we've said, it is an editorial line that's focused on countering the corporate media propaganda that's always fueling regime change, whether that's whitewashing sanctions or praising the Venezuelan opposition, ignoring the all sorts of abuses that they commit, but also giving a voice and amplifying the amazing work being done by the Venezuelan grassroots, even under the most difficult circumstances. Organizations like the Unión Comunera, Jennifer, who was there in Mexico, was recently elected to the national leadership of the Unión Comunera. We have a lot of content, including a video of the Unión Comunera if you want to find out more. It's an inspiring project, just like many others here in the country, who remain committed to building this socialist horizon, and that's something that we at Venezuelanalysis feel that is inspiring and something that everyone in the world, and particularly in the global north, should be aware of, not just as motivation to oppose imperialist intervention, but also as a living example that another world is possible. So with that, it's kind of a small summary of Venezuelanalysis work. I'll echo Jose Luis's appeal for people to support us, and also continue following us, follow the podcast, read our content, and all of that.
And of course, like, share, subscribe, all of the rest of it. Not everybody's in a position to give. We understand. We never put anything behind a paywall. It's always available to the public, but it does help us out. If you're not in a position to give, share with your friends, word of mouth. It's the best way to get our content out there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for another episode of the Venezuelanalysis podcast. Any last words, Ricardo?
Well, I think we pretty much covered it all. We'll have to be vigilant in the run-up to January 10th. And there are some signs that the Venezuelan opposition is going to ramp up its destabilization. But of course, Venezuelanalysis is the place to go to stay in touch with everything. Thanks again, Jose Luis.
We'll see you next time.